LinkedIn presents.
I'm Rufus Griscom, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today's show is about effective altruism. That's the brand of philanthropy where you try to do the most good for the greatest number of people with the resources you have. You probably heard about it a lot if you followed the rise and fall of crypto wunderkind Sam Bankman-Fried. Because before he was convicted of stealing billions of dollars from his customers and sentenced to 25 years in prison, Sam was the movement's poster boy. Sam claimed that he was earning to give, that he was focused on making as much money as humanly possible because he planned to give 99% of it away. And he wasn't planning to donate it all to traditional nonprofits like the Gates Foundation that are focused on here and now issues like reducing extreme hunger. Sam favored the long-termist arm of the movement, whose adherents believe that it is more rational to try and save 1 million future lives from a hypothetical threat like superintelligent AI than it is to pull one person out of poverty today. In the aftermath of Sam's arrest and conviction, many critics took his criminality as evidence that the movement he claimed inspired everything he did was guilty by association. The Washington Post editorial board accused him of using effective altruism as, quote, a cover, running an allegedly fraudulent business in service of a goal that, in light of his alleged ethical corner-cutting, he was unlikely ever to meet. Others, like Nate Silver, are a little more circumspect. In his new book, On the Edge, which comes out later this month, Nate reflects on the time he spent with Sam both before and after his crypto exchange, FTX, imploded. And he concludes, quote, while I don't think effective altruism is exactly to blame for what SBF did, his relationship with the movement isn't an incidental part of the story either. Nate's take is that effective altruism's over-reliance on quantification leads to an unrealistic view of morality. I spoke with Nate about this recently, and we'll be sharing that conversation in 2 parts next week. But today, as a primer, we're trying to understand where the effective altruism movement came from. What are its intellectual underpinnings? Yes, it's been tarnished by its affiliation with Sam Bankman-Fried, but what parts of the cause are still worth celebrating? To answer these questions, we're turning back to the conversation I had with Will MacAskill in September 2022, just a few weeks before FTX went bankrupt. Will is a professor of philosophy at Oxford. He's the guy who got Sam hooked on effective altruism in the first place. And when we spoke, he had just published a manifesto of sorts called What We Owe the Future. I'll concede that effective altruism is not without flaws, but that doesn't mean, in my view, that we should throw the baby out with the bathwater. EA has disrupted the world of global philanthropy. Its followers have given billions to sometimes novel but usually worthy causes. Its founders have inspired thousands of people to pledge significant portions of their income to charitable endeavors. And effective altruists were way ahead of the curve in sounding the alarm about pandemic preparedness and AI risk. When I spoke with Will, OpenAI hadn't yet released ChatGPT. That would come a few months later. But effective altruists have been warning about runaway AI for the better part of a decade. Re-listening to this conversation reminded me how much good the movement has done and how much it can still do.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. TIAA makes you a retirement promise, a promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
Will MacAskill, welcome to the Next Big Idea podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Will, you were recently profiled in The New Yorker. They allege that in your teenage years, you, quote, like to drink too many pints of beer and frolic about in the nude, climbing pitched roofs by night for the life-affirming flush. He was a saxophonist in a campus funk band that played the Mayballs and was known as a hopeless romantic. Is this accurate?
I can't deny any of it, I'm afraid.
So, and your fondness for climbing on buildings at night resulted in, at one point, you're falling through a skylight, which was a pretty serious accident. Did that have an impact on you?
Yeah, I fell through a skylight. I caught myself at hip height. This was on a hotel and a roof in Scotland. But yeah, I put my foot, fell through the skylight, caught myself at weight height. When I pulled myself out, I kind of looked down and saw my own gut membrane.
Oh my God.
There was this like large hole in the side of my body. And I was actually quite lucky because it didn't hit any vital organs. If it punctures that kind of gut membrane, then apparently your guts just pop out violently. It would have been extremely risky, like could have died. And, I actually talk about this a bit in the book, What We Owe the Future. Yeah. And the listener might be thinking, well, what on earth does this have to do with humanity's long-term future? And it's part of an analogy I make where I think of humanity like a teenager, like an adolescent. We've got our whole life in front of us, and yet we're being incredibly reckless, at least as reckless as I was in my teenage years. And if one of the consequences of that recklessness was to end humanity in the same way as one of the consequences of my urban climbing could have been to end my own life, well, that's just one of the most high stakes and foolish decisions or courses of actions we could take.
We may be in the adolescence of our species. It does seem like there are quite a few skylights in front of us as we speak.
Exactly, yeah.
But now returning for a moment to your evolution, it sounds like perhaps the most profound impact on your career path was an essay you read at the age of 18 by Peter Singer, the ethicist, written in 1972 titled Famine, Affluence, and Morality. Do you want to share the thought experiment in that essay and how it affected you?
Sure. The thought experiment is very simple. So imagine a man is walking past a shallow pond, and let's say they're on their way to a business interview, a job interview, and they're wearing a very nice suit. It costs several £1,000s. And while they're walking past that pond, they see that there's a child drowning in that pond. And they could run into that pond, they could save the child, and that child would kind of live to see another day. However, the suit that they're wearing would be ruined. Perhaps they would even have to miss their job interview. And so this would cost them several $1,000s. And now imagine that man kind of sees the child, does the calculation, and thinks, yep, I don't want to lose this few $1,000s by ruining my suit. So I'm going to just walk on by. Now, it seems pretty intuitive, morally speaking, that would be very badly wrong. That, as I like to say, we have a technical term in moral philosophy that that person would be an asshole. That would be a kind of appropriate description for that person's behavior. Instead, we think it's just obvious that if you're weighing up the loss of a few £1,000s or the loss of a child's life, it is just morally required of you of that man to wade into that pond and save the child's life. But then here's the twist. If we think that that's true in this story, then what's the difference between, most of us buying luxury goods, things that are just not necessary for our survival or even basic happiness, rather than donating that money to save the lives of the extreme poor, where just a few $1,000s can save the life of a child who would otherwise have died of malaria. And that's the argument. I found it extremely compelling. In all my years of being a philosopher since that time, I think I've never heard of a compelling counter-argument. And so I think actually we should accept the conclusion that failing to donate when we know we could save lives by doing so is just as wrong as failing to wade into a shallow pond and save a child's life, even if it would cost you a few £1,000s.
It's a powerful argument, but of course that exposes the individual to an almost overwhelmingly large sense of duty to save millions of children and improve the lives of millions of people, which I think for a typical person is kind of paralyzing. And I think most people would feel on an intuitive level that helping people around you that you see is an even higher, that there's a proximity factor there. How do you think about those variables?
So there's two issues. So one is whether you should care about people more just because they're closer to you. But I think that seems certainly not right. So imagine that you see the child drowning in the shallow pond through a telescope, and rather than reaching in and saving them yourself, you can switch the lever that will put a robotic hand into the pond and save the child. I mean, it just doesn't seem like it matters morally. Distance in space just does not seem important. The second issue is more concerning, where, the world we live in, it's not a single child. After you've saved that child, there will be another child that you could save. There will be another one. And there is this question of, well, how far does the logic go? Peter Singer himself concluded that, morally speaking, we should just keep giving our income and keep sacrificing until we're at a similar level to the extremely poor that we're trying to help. What I want to say is, on that latter aspect, is practical limitations get in the way far before the kind of philosophical question really kicks in, where what I've advocated for very many years now is that people should give at least 10% of their income if they're in rich countries. And that, I think, is achievable for most people living in rich countries, certainly if you're middle class. I also think probably it won't have a big impact on your personal well-being. My guess is it's probably even a positive. Certainly my own giving, I think, has been enormous positive to my own well-being.
Yeah.
And then it can help you do an enormous amount of good. And maybe after doing that, you feel inspired. You can give even more, 15%, 20%. But let's at least advocate for, setting 10% as a standard. And let's see if we can do more kind of beyond that point. And rather than thinking, oh, well, because I'm not able to give literally all of my money away, I'm just going to do nothing instead.
And so this thought experiment from Peter Singer changed the course of your career and your life, right? You made a pledge to live on, I think, £26,000 a year, about $30,000 a year, and give the rest to charitable causes. I gather that you were a little concerned when you made this pledge that it might make you less attractive to potential dates, but that seems to have worked out. You've helped to develop this effective altruism movement, which has been remarkably successful at changing the behavior of a large number of people. One thing I find kind of beautiful about this is just the power of an idea, of a piece of writing, an essay written in 1972 to change the course of a human's life, and then in turn to cause kind of a copycat behavior in the positive sense of mimicking behavior from others. And this is, we at the Next Big Idea Club are all about this notion that ideas really change people's lives. And it seems that you have been in the business of trying to figure out how to replicate positive ideas, right? To create a kind of healthy contagion of good ideas. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I also just agree that ideas are remarkably powerful, remarkably important. When Giving What We Can started, this organization that encourages people to pledge 10% of their income, back in 2009, we had 23 people. It was a pretty small scale affair. Now we have over 7,000 people who've committed at least 10% of their income. We've moved over $1 billion to the most pressing and cost-effective nonprofits in the world, saving over 100,000 lives is my estimate. So we really have seen this argument leap from the kind of philosophy seminar room to spreading around the world and really changing behavior. And that has been in part because there have been advocates, I'm one of just many people, saying, look, these ideas are really important. And it just really is important if more people grapple with them. And I think, there was a little bit of a difference between me and Peter Singer in terms of our framing on this, where Peter was very heavy on kind of guilt, where, and that comes out in the way I described the story. It's like, you are acting morally wrongly if you fail to save the child. It's an obligation. Whereas I often prefer to think about things just in terms of like an opportunity, where most of us actually don't need like fancy moral philosophy reasoning to be convinced that it's a good thing to save a child's life. And actually the enemy that we're facing is really apathy. We have so much so many people saying, oh, there's really nothing we can do to help. And it's just not true. By focusing donations on the very most effective nonprofits, you can do a tremendous amount. And if you can, over the course of your life, save dozens of lives, well, why should we not just do that? Isn't that actually like a rich, fulfilling, and wonderful way to live? And it turns out that very many people, thousands and probably tens of thousands of people, think the answer is yes.
It's so inspiring. And what's, the convention that we're accustomed to, certainly in the US, is this notion that you go out, you make an enormous amount of money if you can, and then in the second half of your life, or the last third of your life, then you focus on giving it away, right? So you've got, I think Zuckerberg has said he's going to give away most of his money, but meanwhile, he's buying, $1 million supercars in large chunks of Hawaii. You have these many different examples of how to approach philanthropy, from Bill Gates, who's really, given away $33 billion, I think, in the last 20 plus years in a highly structured way, but with like 2,000 employees managing those decisions. And then you have someone like, Bezos' ex-wife, Mackenzie Scott, who's given away $12 billion in 2 years. What do you think when you look around at these different approaches to philanthropy? How do you think about the sort of moral decision-making?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I really see us as advocating for the new approach to philanthropy, one that's much more serious about the impact we're having on the world, where this idea of, accumulate as much wealth as you can, and then you give it away, perhaps in your will, or perhaps after you've retired. I think that's not always, but very often and ever, where there are enormous problems threatening us today. Thousands of children die every day. There are pressing global risks. We are facing the potential risk of a nuclear war, of a pandemic that could be much worse than COVID-19. These are issues that kind of require attention now. And you are not going to therefore be able to act on those problems if you're waiting kind of 40 years before donating. A second way in which we're advocating for a new approach, well, one is just giving much more as well. So the giving pledge is kind of 50%. I think if you're a billionaire, you should be giving 99%, maybe 99.9%, because I really don't think that those additional millions of dollars are going to make a difference to your well-being, but they can make a transformative difference to the impact that you can have on the world, transformative difference to the lives of many thousands of people. And then finally, it's a new approach in terms of thinking really about the impact you can have. How can you ensure that the money you're using goes as far as possible? And it's been something I've been very happy to see in terms of many, many people thinking in these ways of trying to give significantly more and in the most effective ways. And so I really see this as kind of trying to usher in a new wave of philanthropy that is much more serious about the urgency of the problems that we face today, and appreciating just how much good we can do if we're able to kind of go big, take outcomes seriously, and start donating now.
We've been talking about the effective altruism movement. Your focus has shifted in recent years towards the interests of future people. Can you tell us about long-termism?
Sure. So I'm still extremely committed to effective altruism, trying to do as much good as I can with my time and money. The question is just how best to do that. Of all the many problems that the world faces, what should we focus on? And in particular, there are certain risks that we currently face. The risk from nuclear war, as I mentioned, the risk from pandemics, in particular from engineered pandemics that could be from viruses that are man-made that could be far, far worse than even COVID-19, or the risk from other new technologies like artificial intelligence. And some of these risks can get so bad, I think, that they would be devastating for the present generation, but they would also have this very long-run impact. So they would be utterly catastrophic, not just for the present generation, but for many generations to come, maybe even all future generations indeed, considered as a whole. So we're familiar with this in the case of climate change. Climate change is this huge problem. It's already causing major problems today. It will cause major problems for many generations into the future. But I came to see that this is an issue that's not just limited to climate change. In fact, there are many actions that society is currently doing, or courses of action that society is battling towards, that impose kind of great risks on the present generation, as well as imperiling future generations. And so the idea of long-termism is to really focus on trying to reduce those risks, trying to steer society in a way that we avoid being like my reckless teenage self and unnecessarily destroying civilization altogether. Steering us away from oblivion, steering us away from some long-lasting dystopia, and instead steering us onto a better future, one where we can keep making progress, where we can build a future where everyone is kind of happy and healthy and free.
And part of what's extraordinary about your argument is the math you do about how many future people there are likely to be, right? You say the Earth will remain habitable for hundreds of millions of years. If we survive that long with the same population per century as now, there will be 1 million future people for every person alive today. And one can imagine much larger numbers than that.
Absolutely. So I think we should take the interests of future generations seriously when we're considering these threats, the fact that they will impact people in the generations to come. Well, those generations don't get a say over what we're doing today. But yet I think they should count morally in just the same way that the people in the present generation count. And then, yes, here's the kicker, is just once we start realizing this and paying attention to the fact that actions today might have these very long-run impacts, well, just start looking at the numbers in terms of just how many might be affected, where even on quite conservative estimates of the number of future people, I think future people outnumber the present generation by 1,000 to 1, maybe even 1 million to 1. And that means for those things that really do have these long-lasting impacts, well, ensuring that we get them right is just of the utmost importance.
And you say the premises are simple. This is the premise of long-termism. And I don't think they're particularly controversial, yet taking them seriously amounts to a moral revolution. How so?
At the moment, how much of the world's resources and political attention really gets spent thinking about what are the events that could impact future generations on our long-term future? And I think it's very small. Certainly, if we exclude climate change, I think it's something like, maybe it's 0.01% of world GDP. That could be much higher. We could spend 1% of world GDP, 1% of our political attention on issues that impact future generations. What could that look like? Well, I think it could mean, for example, we have a department for future generations in every government of every rich country around the world, in the same way that there's a department for international development that's dedicated to trying to improve the lives of the poorest people in the world, and in the same way that's so crucial. We could build forecasting much more into our current political system, such that government decision makers are actually much better equipped to think about the risks we face over the coming years or even coming decades. We could be investing much more in defensive measures against dangerous new technology, in particular, next generation bioweapons. We could be identifying those threats and taking action. And then, above all, there could just be a cultural change where we're less focused as a political community on the next business cycle, the next electoral cycle, and instead we're spending much more of our attention thinking about, well, what are the issues that are not maybe the latest scandal that some politician has gotten into, but what are the issues that are actually potentially catastrophic for the world today and potentially catastrophic for future generations too. And I have suggestions in the book, but I would see that as kind of an ongoing conversation, an ongoing set of things we have to think about.
I mean, one of the assertions that's kind of surprisingly radical, in the book and in your thinking, is this notion that more happy people is good, right? So the conventional wisdom among most of my liberal do-gooder friends would be that more people is bad. 8 billion people on the planet is too many. But, I was fascinated by, I think at some point in the book you say, if the entire planet had the population density of the Netherlands, the Earth could support, I think the number was 70 billion people. Most people listening are just going to flinch at the idea of 70 billion people on planet Earth, right? But if one can imagine endless clean energy, desalination, and wonderful technologies that could actually make that possible without defiling the Earth, but in a way that was actually quite, there's still lots of lovely nature and trees and so on. And by the way, if you bicycle around the Netherlands, there's lots of beautiful open spaces, right? Yeah. One can conceive of a future version of the Earth, potentially with 70 billion inhabitants, that was quite beautiful and wonderful. Do you think that's, but that's a pretty contrarian fantasy?
Yeah, so I'll emphasize that in the book, I'm not advocating that the Earth should have a population of 70 billion people.
Sure.
That part of the book was just saying, as a prediction about the future, well, we already have a world with 8 billion people compared to 8 million people when we were hunter-gatherers. It's a 1,000-fold increase. Perhaps it could increase tenfold again. But I do think that many people are misinformed or kind of misconceiving the issue when they think about population size, where often people only look at one size of the ledger. Think about adding a new person to the world. They have harms. They, through their consumption, will cause more carbon dioxide to be released. That has a harmful impact. But we need to look at both sides of the ledger because people contribute positively to society too. They work, they build infrastructure, they help build a better society, they pay taxes. They also innovate. If there had only been half as many people historically, it's not the case that we would be living in the same world today, except, a little less crowded. Rather, we would all be farmers. We would have none of the perks of modern living. We would be having surgery without anesthetic because we would have had half as many scientists and innovators and engineers in the past too.
Yeah.
And so when we look to the future, in my view, the best forecasts on population suggest that population size will peak around the year 2060. Other estimates have it later, towards 2100, but that's the sort of window we're looking at. And then it will start to exponentially decline. And so the future that we're looking at on kind of business as usual trajectory is not one of ever more people kind of crowding up the world. It's actually one of a shrinking population. And I think that poses actually a number of risks, including potential stalling of technological and economic progress that's helped improve material living standards across the world. And so, if anything, I'm actually a little bit more worried by what we might call underpopulation compared to overpopulation.
So would you make the case for continued growth at roughly the pace that we've been growing, or what's your view?
I certainly think that we should avoid population decline. And we're seeing some countries realizing that this is a crisis already. So South Korea in particular, their fertility rate is now 0.81 births per woman. And they've just dramatically increased the kind of amount of family support. That's a situation that we will be facing too in the coming decades. And so, I think that we should be having an attitude that is not at least demonizing people who have children, and instead have a world where our population growth is at least closer to replacement, or if not a little above.
Now, of course, there are many dire scenarios that we will talk about. But before we get to the dire scenarios, let's talk a little more about what wonderful versions of our possible future. You write, the future could be wonderful. We could create a flourishing and long-lasting society where everyone's lives are better than the very best lives today. How would we arrive at that? What would that look like?
So I think the argument for thinking that people's lives in the future at least might, so I'm not saying that this is very likely, it's just on the table, might be much, much better than even the best lives today, is by comparing the best lives of, let's say, 300 years ago with the best lives today, where some rich, perhaps they're aristocratic man in England in 1700, they would not have barely been able to travel. They would have had no pain relief. They could easily have died of cholera or syphilis. They would have had to have surgery without anesthetic and wouldn't have had anything in the way of modern medicine. Even their diet would have been pretty boring compared to the diets of basically any of the listeners here. If they were gay, they couldn't have loved openly, and they wouldn't have lived in a democracy either. Now, this is all for someone who's really very well off in 1700, let alone talking about people in poorer countries than women who didn't have the benefits of feminism, or they didn't have access to university education, or for the majority of people in the world who were victims of some form of forced labor. So then, what that shows to me is that if we look more speculatively a few hundred years out, and we just think about some fixed up version of our current world where, everyone around the world has lives as good as, the best off people in countries like, I don't know, Sweden or Costa Rica, or places where you think, oh, some people have really good lives. I think that actually dramatically underestimates how good life in the future could be if we manage to sustain continued moral progress and continued technological progress, if we manage to avoid some of these risks that I'm sure we'll get onto.
How do you think of sort of human well-being today compared with our ancestral past?
Yeah, so this is something that I dig into at some length in one of the chapters of What We Owe the Future. The thing that I think is true is that hunter-gatherers had better lives than agriculturalists, people that lived in farming societies. So their life was more egalitarian. They were healthier, tended to live longer. However, I think their lives were still much worse than the lives of at least certainly the large majority of people alive today. Their life expectancy, it was still only a few decades, whereas life expectancy now is well into the 70s. They were still at risk of dying from various diseases or an infected wound or kind of raiding from another group. They could not travel widely. They were very often in conditions of fear or food scarcity or cold. The idea of just running hot water would just be unthinkable at such a time, let alone kind of all of the other perks that we have today. And so then also just when you look at the data too, it definitely seems like there's a strong correlation between just how economically well off, like how rich a country is per capita and how happy people are. And extrapolating that out strongly suggests that that would be true for hunter-gatherers too.
I'll very briefly take a contrarian position, which is, we had a very interesting conversation with Dr. Anna Lemke about the hedonic set point and the way that pleasure and pain are sort of correlated. And I would think in all the ways that we could measure human happiness, I would think that like frequency of laughter might be one. Social connection, right? And interpersonal and physical joy. And based on a lot of anthropological accounts, it feels to me like an argument can be made that the way that people live together, frequency of laughter, connection, may have been greater in some hunter-gatherer environments. However, I think we're figuring that out, right? I think that we're in a very interesting moment where, as a species, we're realizing that maybe some elements of how we've chosen to live in the last several hundred years have not been optimal necessarily for human happiness. But one can imagine in the coming decades and centuries that we will get much better at figuring out how to live together in ways that optimize our human joy.
Absolutely. I'm no defender of modern day consumerist culture, where one thing that's just remarkable to me is just how much economic wealth we have built up and how poorly we turn it into human happiness.
Yeah.
People often talk to me about my giving and are kind of surprised that I regard it as, a net positive in my well-being. And that's because the best things in life are free. It's a cliche, but think of having a wonderful relationship, wonderful friends, music, dancing, enjoying nature. All of these things are free. And I think it is absolutely the case that, there are these very strong incentives for corporations to really emphasize to you how important the latest bit of technology or the latest luxury item will be to your well-being. And I think it's systematically wrong. And so, one thing I am hopeful for is that there'll be a move away from that. And instead, we'll start to learn more and more about, how we actually can live wonderful, flourishing lives with with the truly magical technology and societies that we've created.
Well, for those skeptics listening who are shaking their heads at our techno-utopianism, I think we can easily make those listeners happy by turning to some of the downside scenarios. Because you say...
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely.
You say, following your quote in the book, you write, the lives of future humans could be unimaginably beautiful. But you go on to say, or the future could be terrible, falling to authoritarians who use surveillance and AI to lock in their ideology for all time. Or, as if it couldn't get worse, there could be no future at all, right? So turning to the downside, these are very different scenarios. What are the risks we're facing?
Yeah, so thanks for that segue, because my view exactly is that technology can be used for good or bad. In the 1940s, we harnessed the power of the atom, and that has some good consequences. We could have unlimited clean energy, or not quite unlimited, but abundant clean energy. There were also negatives. It's how we have atomic weapons that were unprecedented in terms of the destructive power. And I think the technologies that are in development at the moment, there are some that are extremely scary. So the easiest to understand of these is engineered viruses. So essentially things that can be used in the next generation of weapons of mass destruction, in particular bioweapons, where many countries have had major bioweapons programs in the past. We now have technology like gene editing technology that can basically allow us to take an existing virus and upgrade it, where that means you make it more infectious, you make it more lethal. So you just increase the amount of potential damage that could be caused. That ability is getting ever more powerful every year. It's also getting more democratized, where it's within the reach of many, many more scientists. And the really scary scenario is, well, imagine a world 10 years' time, 20 years' time, where now it's not just thousands of scientists, it's millions of people all around the world, including hobbyists, people working out of their garage, who, if they wanted, if they choose to, could create viruses that are far more deadly for humans than any viruses that exist in nature. And then all it would take is for one kind of bad actor, one terrorist group, or perhaps one government to use such a virus. And then you would have, a pandemic the likes of which the world has never seen. That's really scary. That's something that we need to be thinking about well in advance, before these technologies are already widely deployed. Because COVID-19 was bad enough, things could be 100 times worse again.
Yeah, I've been haunted by Nick Bostrom's vulnerable world hypothesis ever since I first read about it, which many of our listeners will know is his hypothesis that you have an urn of creativity out of which you pull these beautiful glowing balls of these incredible new technological inventions. But there's a probability that at some point there's a black ball that comes out, or as you say, it might be a gray ball that, like nuclear power, that confers both benefits and exposes us to risks. And it seems like, our human monkey brains are not great at understanding exponential growth of technological power, which, when you look at the pace of technological acceleration, it does appear to be exponential and not linear. And which brings us to, I think, the other major risk that you spent some time on, which is AGI, artificial general intelligence, and the risks that might present.
So, artificial intelligence, it's a booming field of research at the moment. It's maybe the technology that's moving fastest out of all kind of technological progress. And there are major causes, I think, major potential risks that we could see really in the next decade, coming couple of decades. And I kind of focus in particular on risks that arise when we get to a level of AI systems that are as good as human beings, or better, at basically all human tasks. Why is that so important? I think the core issue is that such development could lead to radically faster rates of innovation, of economic progress, of technological progress, or I should say advancement rather than progress, because it's not necessarily good. Where if you think about the world now and the rate of change and technological innovation we have compared to the world for most of human history, well, for almost the whole agricultural era, economic growth was like 0.1% per year. And then came along the industrial revolutions, and things started moving about 30 times as fast as it did in the past. It used to be that the world you saw when you died was basically the same as the world you saw when you were alive. Now things change much, much more rapidly. That had enormous consequences for the world. I think the same thing could happen with AI, where if you take the really pretty standard economic models and plug in this idea of having AI systems that can do everything human beings can, including research and development, including the research and development of AI systems themselves that can then help with further research and development of even better AI systems, well, you get this conclusion that things can start moving very fast indeed. And you might get centuries worth of technological progress happening in decades, maybe even years, maybe even less. So that means like a lot can happen. I think one thing is just we should be paying more attention to this. Mm-hmm. But there are a couple of particular risks. So one most closely associated with Nick Bostrom is the idea of simply losing control to artificial intelligences themselves. So imagine the perspective of the growth of Homo sapiens as a species from the perspective of the chimpanzees. Homo sapiens were just getting more and more powerful, smarter and smarter, able to work together. And before long, on evolutionary timescales, Homo sapiens simply outcompeted the chimpanzees. There's now no hope at all that the chimpanzees will control the future rather than Homo sapiens. The argument is that the same might be true for AI systems. They will get smarter and smarter and smarter. And unless we have aligned them with human interests, then they may pursue goals that are utterly alien from our perspective, utterly valueless. They could even see humanity as an obstacle to the pursuit of their goals. So they would want to eliminate the competition, as it were. And that's a very terrifying prospect.
Even for those of us who are somewhat skeptical about the most sort of aggressive timetables about when artificial general intelligence might emerge, or even those who may say, "Oh, well, it will never emerge," nonetheless have to see that there's been an acceleration in recent years. Right, we've seen DeepMind's AI network solve one of biology's greatest problems, determining the three-dimensional shape of a protein based on its amino acid sequence, just happened. And this could be phenomenal, right, for development of new drugs. And a lot of this is potentially powerfully good. We had a deep learning model at MIT create a new antibiotic that effectively kills the world's most problematic disease-causing bacteria. Right, we've got like language models now solving college level math problems in seconds. Right, I mean this is all in the last few years. So even if one's skeptical about, for instance, artificial intelligence ever gaining consciousness, that some would say is a red herring. It's really not about developing consciousness. Even if they develop enough intelligence that does not have volition or consciousness that bad actor humans can deploy, that in and of itself can be a nuclear weapon times 10, potentially.
Yeah, so this is the second part of the risk where you might think, okay, well, we'll be able to align artificial systems with human interests, or perhaps we'll never design them in a way such that they're genuinely agents. Instead, they'll just be more like these tools. However, that doesn't mean that we've solved all the problems, because I think there could be tremendous risks coming from misuse of AI systems, in particular the entrenchment of power, where, many people alive today are already extremely concerned by the level of inequality of resources and power in the world today. I think that could get far worse. I think it could get 1,000-fold worse. And AI systems could enable that. In particular, I'm worried that the kind of underlying technological conditions that make democracy kind of socially attractive societal structure are somewhat fragile. Where imagine now you've got political movement, political leadership with authoritarian tendencies, or you're in an authoritarian country, but you have human-level artificial intelligence, you have an automated workforce. It no longer really needs to be the case that you need to please the populace. They are not where your wealth is coming from. Similarly, you can know what your entire populace is doing because you've extraordinarily advanced surveillance. Similarly, if you want to quell any potential rebellions? Well, you have an automated army, an automated police force. So it seems to me that it would be AI would give much greater potential power to political elites to entrench their power. If things were moving very fast, because technology was moving so fast, I think that would compound the problem too. And so I think we could end up in a world where almost all power is concentrated in the hands of a single country or company or even individual. And that's a worry that we have, even if we manage to align AI systems with human interests.
The moon belongs to everyone. The best things in life are free. The stars belong to everyone. They gleam there for you and me.
The LinkedIn Podcast Network is sponsored by TIAA. In the last 100 years, we've seen financial markets swing, new currencies come and go, decades of savings lost in days, all showing that a retirement plan without a guarantee, quite simply, isn't enough. So more than a retirement plan, TIAA makes you a retirement promise. A promise of a guaranteed retirement paycheck for life. A promise that pays off. Learn more at TIAA.org/promisespayoff.
Hi, I'm Kwame Christian, CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, and I have a quick question for you. When was the last time you had a difficult conversation? These conversations happen all the time, and that's exactly why you should listen to Negotiate Anything, the #1 negotiation podcast in the world. We produce episodes every single day to help you lead, persuade, and resolve conflicts both at work and at home. So level up your negotiation skills by making Negotiate Anything part of your daily routine.
So when we think of these three threats to the future of humanity that have come up so far, global warming, biohacking, and AGI, I think currently global warming is probably the concern that is most prevalent among among people I know. Do you think that concern is misplaced? Or, I mean, obviously, on the one hand, I'm guessing you would say, well, you know what, it's great that we have the beginning of a general awareness of the fact that we need to take action at scale, and that's somewhat historically unprecedented, right? For us to really make personal sacrifices and change behaviors and change policies in anticipation of things that could happen in decades, right? I mean, that's a somewhat new human behavior. So it's great to see that happen, but the threat of global warming, as terrifying as it is not as terrifying as these scenarios when we look at this risk we may be exposed to in the next century as biohacking and AGI. Is that your view?
Firstly, I want to say that the environmentalist and climate change movement has been just outstanding, in my view. The fact that there's just been rising up of people taking science seriously, having concern for future generations, and then actually having really major successes in terms of steering the world onto a better trajectory with respect to our carbon emissions is, very inspiring to me. And in What We Owe the Future, I focus on these issues like AI and like pandemics, in significant part because they get a tiny fraction of the current resources and attention, where global spending on climate change is on the order of a few $100 billion per year. How much gets spent on AI safety? It's more like 100 or 200 million per year. So that's a factor of 1,000 difference. And, it's been in the news much more recently because people like Nick Bostrom have been advocating for more concern, but it's still very early days. And so I really wouldn't say that concern for climate change is misplaced. It's just, I think a sane world would have solved the climate problem decades ago.
Yes.
I just think that we should generalize from this. We should realize, it's not just about carbon emissions. Actually, there are very many ways in which society is battling towards a kind of uncertain future that perhaps could be very good, but also could be very bad indeed. It could be oblivion. It could be a long-lasting dystopian future.
So I love that comment. We should learn from the case of global warming, because a sane world would have solved these problems decades ago. But we need, as a species, I think you would say, to be able to act upon trying to protect ourselves against risks about which we're not 100% certain. Someone listening might say, like, well, biohacking, artificial intelligence risk, I'm not sure those are risks. They might be. Well, if they might be, right, if we put those risks at anywhere above, some might say 10%, some might say 5%, some might say 1% of powerfully negatively impacting the future of humanity, we should be taking those actions.
Exactly. So sometimes people ask me, oh, well, I'm skeptical of this long-termist stuff. Suppose I'd had a long-termist perspective, in the past. Well, would that have, what would I have done differently? And the answer is 50 years ago, 100 years ago, a long-termist perspective would have alerted us to the risks from climate change, where we had a reasonably good quantitative, it was very speculative. 100%, it was very speculative. But as early as 1896, climate scientist Svante Arrhenius had a quantitative estimate of the warming that CO2 would cause. And it wasn't far wrong, actually. It was like a little high, but it wasn't wildly off the best estimates. We could have been building a movement that was concerned about our carbon emissions many decades earlier than we in fact did. That would have meant that things were just much easier as well, where, almost the large majority of carbon emissions have been emitted in the last 30 years. Imagine if we'd gotten started in the 50s and 60s about to move society off of carbon emissions. We could be in a much, much better place now. And I think the same is just true with respect to developments in artificial intelligence, with respect to engineering of new viruses. Yes, this is often more speculative than other things we could be doing. However, we are able to get in at an early stage and steer the course of this whole technology. And so that means that even though we're acting on somewhat more speculative evidence, although I should say these trends are actually, they're pretty reliable trends. Nonetheless, we're acting on somewhat more speculative evidence, but the leverage we can have, the impact we can have is absolutely huge, because we're getting in before the problem. We have seen the problems in the world, so we can help have sensible regulation, safe technology developed ahead of time, such that we never have to deal with problems in the first place, rather than dealing with kind of an entrenched lobby or dealing with kind of catastrophes after they've occurred.
And of course, the danger is that it could be a case that looks more like nuclear energy in the 1970s, when you had environmentalists opposing, nuclear power plants, and now with 2020 hindsight, I think most experts would say that was a mistake, that we've actually we've exacerbated global warming because of this kind of somewhat alarmist fear around nuclear energy. Do you worry about whether we're calling it right when we identify these problems? And does that inform the prescription? Like you're not making the case that we should stop all artificial intelligence research. You're making the case that we should approach it differently.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we should be extremely aware of what we don't know. And I think we should be careful in the actions we take, looking for things that just seem really robustly good across a wide variety of perspectives, where some of the things we can do to protect against pandemics, they just look very good. So it's early warning detection, like early detection of new pathogens from wastewater. So you can find some protein that is exponentially increasing and say, oh my God, we really might have a new pandemic on our hands. It's just very hard to see how that causes some major catastrophe for the world. Similarly, with various forms of sterilization technology, like low wavelength lighting that can safely remove viruses from the air without being harmful in any way to people. This is just, again, seems kind of very robustly good. Could actually just dramatically decrease the rate of respiratory infections in the world. Whereas other things perhaps we're more unsure about, they look less robustly good. I think those are the things we want to save maybe for the later date when we have better understanding. And then the final thing that I think this consideration brings out is just what we really need is a movement of people who are reflective yet morally concerned, who are trying to do as much good as they can, but are aware of how little they know, are doing further research such that we have a full understanding of the world and where we're headed. And so that when we do have new, crucial insights or things that really change how we should be thinking about things, we're able to adapt. That's the kind of ideal scenario, because it really doesn't need to be the case that nuclear power is still so tainted, but yet it is.
So we are a bunch of frisky teenagers climbing on rooftops as a species, right? We've maybe thrown back a few pints of beer and we're bouncing around on pitched roofs, climbing over skylights. And you make the case that in retrospect, we may, as a species, look back at this moment in history and say that was a clutch series of decades where decisions were made to stabilize the threat of emerging technologies, make some smart decisions for the species, which could result in literally, potentially millions of years of large-scale human flourishing. In the upside scenario, in the downside scenario, we fall through the skylight, our guts are hanging out. You made it through that experience, but we may or may not, or if we make it, it could end up in bad shape.
Exactly. I think we're living at this critical period in human history, a period that my colleague Toby Ord calls the precipice.
Yeah.
It's a moment where, we're teetering on the brink. We could go in one of three directions. It could be utopia, dystopia, or oblivion. All of these things are open. Which one of those we get depends in significant part on what happens in the course of this century. And what happens in the course of this century depends in significant part on just what we decide to do, including the people listening to this podcast.
I have a suspicion that humans have probably often felt that the moment they're living in was a clutch moment for the future of humanity. And yet I think I fundamentally buy your argument that this might actually be a particularly critical one. I was fascinated by your observation that this may prove to be a rare moment in which we can, in conversations like this one, communicate with our entire species, or at least maybe through quite a few conversations like this one. And you point out that for tens of thousands of years, humans were unaware of other humans on the opposite side of the globe. So we were living in relatively small groups, and might have been millions of humans distributed across the globe, but we were unaware of them. Hundreds of thousands of years from now, if we colonize the heavens, if we become a spacefaring species, we will also become balkanized and no longer able to communicate because of the constraint of the speed of light. It's kind of an extraordinary statement. So that in effect, this is a moment where we're all in the same room, we're huddling up and saying like, "Hey team, we're all here. Let's figure this out."
Exactly. It is a really striking fact about the world where for at least tens of thousands of years, even in principle, many groups of human beings just could not talk to each other. One thing that's so striking to me is that around the beginning of the Christian calendar, so 1 AD or 100 AD, the Roman Empire and the Han Empire, they each comprise about 30% of the world population. So between the majority of the world population, and they were on the same kind of continental mass of Eurasia. And yet they barely knew of each other.
Extraordinary.
They were aware, but they had almost no understanding. Yet now we're in a circumstance where I am talking to you many thousands of miles away instantaneously. That is unprecedented. And it is absolutely right that in the future, like if one day humanity settles the stars, well, even the closest solar system, in principle, it will take 8 years for any communication there and back to occur. And as you say, like when we really look far into the future, 150 billion years, then between different groups of galaxies, communication will be in principle impossible. And what does this mean? Well, it means that say there's one dangerous ideology and it takes over the whole world. That's everything. You don't have redundancy in this system. And it means if there's some world war and a single country were able to take over the entire world, again, that's everybody. And so I think that creates particular vulnerabilities especially when we're thinking about that first question of utopia versus dystopia. It also creates particular worries when it comes to risks as well. The fact that we're so globally interconnected, that everyone is united, it means that there really could be a pandemic that kills, everyone in the world. There are very small groups who are isolated, but 99.99% of people are connected such that they could be affected by a sufficiently powerful new virus.
Well, Will, I for one, am wildly inspired by the work that you have been doing and are continuing to do. And yet it has provoked controversy. I think there's some constituencies that feel like the EA, effective altruism movement, is a bunch of math nerds lecturing us on how to do good. And some of their conclusions seem wildly counterintuitive, that, extreme utilitarianism ends up feeling almost paradoxically lacking in empathy or lacking in humanity. What do you think of kind of the limitations of the logic that has informed effective altruism and long-termism? And do you think any of the criticisms are valid?
Sure. I mean, I think there are a lot of misunderstandings of what effective altruism and long-termism are trying to do. And the most important misunderstanding by far, is not appreciating that what we're talking about is just what should we be doing on the margin. So, and where that means, in general, we're not saying this is how the entire world should be constituted. Instead, it's, look, if you've got some additional donation, additional amount of time you could be spending, or there's some just like way in which we should tweak the world. What should that be? What are the very most pressing problems at the moment? So take the example of long-termism, where sometimes people say, oh, you care about future generations. You say how many of them. So you're saying we should be spending 99.999% of the world's resources just devoted, like sacrificing ourselves for the service of posterity? And I'm saying, no. What I'm saying at the moment is that we spend almost nothing as a society thinking or working to make the world better for future generations. Maybe let's move that to 0.1%, 1% of global resources. Then at that point, maybe we can start having a philosophical conversation about how strong our obligations are to future generations. But we're not even close to this like barest minimum.
You said earlier that your approach is to be less, say, judgmental than Peter Singer has been in some of his writings. And I think that perhaps that's where some people take umbrage. You think of sort of the argument that, well, someone who could potentially make a lot of money on Wall Street should go and do that so that they can have a higher utility in solving future problems. Some would see that as discounting the sort of the goodness and the beauty of the choice of a very intelligent person who chose not to work on Wall Street and instead chose to teach fifth grade English. Right. And there's something beautiful about that choice, right? So I think maybe the more kind of extreme utilitarianism some perceive as discrediting some sort of brave personal choices that have a different quality.
Yeah, so you might think that the way we should make life decisions is not really in terms of thinking about outcomes. Instead, there's, like you say, some choices that are brave or beautiful. And these are descriptors that aren't necessarily about, measuring things and how much you've made the world better, even in principle. And my response to that is like, that might well be true in a world, that the right way to make decisions, in a world that was much more just than the world we live in today.
Interesting.
But we live in a radically unjust world. It's much more like, I think our moral intuitions are much more accurate if we're thinking, okay, how do you think you ought to live if you were living in the run-up to World War II, or even during World War II? Or how should you think you should be living if you were living during the Roman Empire, where 30% of people were slaves, where people were just being tortured in the Colosseum? We live in a world where the vast majority of wealth and income is possessed by a tiny fraction of people. And that if you're listening to this podcast, you're almost certainly in the richest 10% of the world's population. You're probably in the richest few percent of the world's population. You can look this up on givingwhatwecan.org. We have calculator. And I just think that means that given that situation that we find ourselves in, one part of living a good life is trying to use your life, at least to a significant extent, not an overwhelming 100% extent, but at least to a significant extent, trying to make the world a significantly better place than how you found it. And I just think that that view is hard to argue against.
Yeah. So the argument is the level of urgency here. We're in a burning building potentially arranging flowers that everybody enjoys is a wonderful thing to do. Not discounting that at all, but the building's on fire. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
The final question I have for you, Will, is living our everyday lives. And I know this must be a question you ask yourself. How do we balance taking joy in the moment, in the day? I mean, of course, according to utilitarians, the point of it all, right? The good that we're trying to maximize is actually human joy, right? So that's part of our job as humans, right? As sentient humans, is to experience and radiate and share joy. And at some point, though, there is a zero-sum game in terms of time allocation, right? Between the experience of joy and doing the very hard work and engaging in the self-sacrifice necessary for advocating for the joy of other humans and very critically, future humans. Do you feel like you've been sort of put on this earth to some degree to advocate for future humans? Are you allowed to experience joy as fully as you would like to? How do you feel about that?
Sure, yeah. I definitely think I'm allowed to experience joy. And as you say, if you're the utilitarian, then on your days off, you have a moral obligation to have fun.
Exactly, right.
You're doing something wrong if you just do something you don't actually find enjoyable.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
I mean, I guess I'll say two things. So one is, in no way what I'm advocating for is utilitarianism. I think we should place weight on an array of different moral views and, take a good compromise between them. And so you should see kind of the utilitarian view, promotion of just well-being impartially considered. That's one significant part of what's going on morally, but it's not necessarily the only part. And then the second thing is just a more pragmatic matter, which is just to stay sane. I think you should just do a little bit of kind of accounting or budgeting in your life where, look, once a year perhaps, or just on occasional periods, set a policy for yourself. What careers are you going to pursue? What job are you going to pursue? How much are you planning to give? What other things are you going to do? You make that decision in a careful, reflective moment. And then the rest of the time, you don't need to worry about it. You've set the parameters for your life. Beyond that, then you just be a human, live a kind of rich, enjoyable life. And that's certainly how I've approached things. And I think it's both more rewarding and more impactful. When I first started being concerned by the extremity of global poverty and how much we can help, I was wrestling with decisions every single day. Should I buy a slightly nicer cereal, even though it costs me slightly more?
Right. Sure,
That's neither healthy nor is it productive. Whereas instead, when I thought, look, this is how I'm going to live my life. I'm going to have an income of £26,000, £27,000 post-tax, and I'm going to give everything above that away to charity. I'm going to, I think about my career. I make conscious career decisions. And then beyond that, I try and work hard. And the rest of the time, I have a good time. And I think that's both the most impactful and happier way to be.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because reading your book, I felt both inspired, intellectually engaged, is fascinating, and a little bit like an asshole. Like I felt a little bit of unworthy for not having done more than I have. So even though I know your intention is not to cause people to feel badly about themselves, I think that might be a necessary part of the sort of the cocktail of responses that produces engagement and reform and more action.
Sure. Well, if it motivates you to doing more, then that's good. But otherwise, I think feeling like an asshole is often not very productive. And instead just think, look, we have this tremendous opportunity to do good. For the present generation, we have this tremendous opportunity to do good for the generations to come too. like, this is an exciting, inspiring opportunity, and let's take it.
Will MacAskill, thank you for taking time out of your very busy life to be with us today. Such a fascinating conversation.
Thank you for having me on. It was really fun.
That was Will MacAskill, author of the new book, What We Owe the Future. If you'd like to hear more from him, try downloading the Next Big Idea app. There you can hear Will share the 5 key insights from the book in just 12 minutes. And Will is just one author among hundreds. Nowhere else on the planet can you hear folks like Walter Isaacson, Anne Lamott, Greg McEwen, and Arthur C. Brooks share the key insights from their books directly with you. To get started, all you have to do is download the Next Big Idea app. If you enjoyed this show and are wondering, what can I do to help them out? Here's what you can do. First, we'd be ever so grateful if you'd recommend the Next Big Idea to a friend. Next, we'd be delighted if you'd leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you're listening right now. It really helps us get the word out. Today's episode was written and produced by Caleb Bissinger. Sound design by Mike Toda. Our executive producer is Michael Kovnat. The team at the LinkedIn Podcast Network are a big part of our future. I'm Rufus Griscom. See you next week.